I'm glad you're here. Follow my story all the way to the end and drop the name of your city in the comments. I love hearing from every single one of you. I was sitting on a rocking chair on my sister's front porch in Savannah, watching the Spanish moss sway in the evening breeze, when my phone buzzed on the armrest. I'd driven down for her 68th birthday, a long weekend away from the farm for the first time in nearly 2 years. My knee had been aching from the 7-hour drive, and I was finally starting to feel something close to relaxed when I glanced at the screen. It was a text from my son, Brandon. Hey, Mom. Just so you know, Serena and I handled the paperwork on the land title. Easier this way while you're gone. Don't worry about it. Have fun with Aunt Carol. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on my knee and looked out at the street, where kids were chasing fireflies in the last light of a summer evening. My sister Carol came out with 2 glasses of sweet tea and stopped when she saw my face. What happened? And quit. Nothing, I said. And I meant it. Because nothing had happened, at least nothing my son could use. I picked up the phone and typed back, "Okay, honey. Enjoying the trip. Talk soon." Then I smiled, because Brandon had just made the same mistake his father had made 40 years ago, right before I caught him gambling away our savings. He had assumed that because I was quiet, I wasn't paying attention. Carol sat down beside me. "Margaret, what did that boy do?" "He thinks he sold the farm," I said. She stared at me. "He thinks?" I took a long sip of sweet tea. He forgot about the clause. Let me back up, because none of this started with that text message. It started 3 years ago. At my dining room table, when Brandon first brought Serena home for Thanksgiving, and she looked around at my farmhouse, the way a developer looks at an empty lot. I've lived on that land for 43 years. My late husband Gerald and I bought it when we were young and foolish enough to think 112 acres in central Tennessee was a manageable undertaking. We were wrong, but we were stubborn, and we made it work. We raised cattle, grew tobacco for a while, then switched to soybeans when the market shifted. We built the house ourselves, room by room, summer by summer. Gerald poured the back porch foundation on our 10th anniversary. I planted the magnolia tree out front when Brandon was born. That land is not just property to me. It is every callus on my hands and every year of my life that mattered. Gerald passed 6 years ago. Sudden heart attack, right out in the South Field on a Tuesday morning in October. I found him myself. After that, it was just me and the hired hands and Ruth next door, who has been my closest friend for 31 years, and who showed up on my doorstep the morning of Gerald's funeral with a casserole and the good sense not to say anything. Brandon had always been a decent son, thoughtful in the way that young men sometimes are when they want something from you, but decent enough. He'd moved to Nashville after college, bounced between jobs in sales and marketing, never quite landing. I helped when I could, a few thousand here and there when rent got tight, a loan when his car died, another when he wanted to start a landscaping business that never got off the ground. He always promised to pay it back when things picked up. Things never picked up. Then he met Serena Whitfield at some rooftop party in Nashville, and within 8 months they were engaged. I'd never seen Brandon move fast about anything in his life, so the speed of it gave me pause. Serena was polished in the way that women are when they've grown up wealthy and learned to perform warmth without ever quite feeling it. She had a bright smile and sharp eyes and the habit of complimenting things she was actually evaluating. When she toured my kitchen that first Thanksgiving, she said, "This is so charming," the way people say it when they mean something else entirely. Her father, Dale Whitfield, owned Whitfield Land Partners, a mid-sized development company out of Franklin that had been buying up rural property for mixed-use projects. I didn't know that at the time. I found it out later, after I started paying attention. The first sign came 6 months after the wedding. Brandon called on a Sunday, which was unusual because he preferred texting, and his voice had that careful, rehearsed quality I recognized from his teenage years when he was about to ask for something he knew I'd say no to. "Mom, I've been thinking. The farm is a real asset, but you're carrying it alone. What if I helped you manage it? Serena and I could even move out there eventually. But for administrative purposes, it might make sense to have my name on the deed too, just to make things easier. Easier for who? I asked. For everyone. For estate planning. If something happened to you? If something happens to me, my lawyer has everything organized, I said. Philip Hartwell, I'll give you his number. There was a long pause. You already have a lawyer? I've had a lawyer for 20 years, Brandon. Philip handled your father's estate. He dropped it that day. But he brought it up again 3 months later, framed differently: tax advantages, property management, protecting the asset from probate. Each time I said I'd think about it. And each time I called Philip the next morning. Philip Hartwell is 73 years old and has the patience of someone who has spent 5 decades watching families make the same mistakes. He didn't ask me why I was calling about protecting the deed from my own son. He just listened. And when I was done, he said, "You want to set it up so that any transfer, without your direct, in-person authorization, is automatically void?" "Yes," I said. "Give me 2 weeks." I signed the trust documents on a Thursday afternoon in Philip's office. The key provision was simple. No transfer of ownership, no lien, no encumbrance of any kind could be recorded against the property without my signature. Notarized. In person. Within 30 days of filing. Anything else would trigger an automatic revocation clause that snapped ownership back to me, regardless of what was recorded at the county level. Philip also suggested I keep a recorded conversation documenting that I had not authorized any changes to the title. I thought that was excessive. I recorded it anyway. "You're being careful," Philip said as I was leaving. "I've been a farmer for 40 years, I told him. Careful is the only reason I still have land. I didn't tell Brandon any of this. I just started watching. What I saw over the following year was a patient, methodical process. Brandon and Serena began visiting more frequently, which should have been a good thing. They brought wine and helped with dishes. Serena asked thoughtful questions about the property, the acreage, the water rights, the condition of the access road, whether the back 40 had ever been surveyed separately. She said she was just curious. She said she loved the land. I let her ask. I answered some questions and deflected others and remembered every single one. Then, 6 months before that text message arrived, something shifted. Serena's father's company had a bad quarter. I'd seen it mentioned in a Nashville business newsletter I'd started reading specifically because of him. A mixed-use development near Murfreesboro had stalled out. Investors were nervous. And suddenly Brandon's visits became more purposeful. He stopped pretending to be interested in cattle rotation and started talking about the property's potential. He started mentioning that the land was underutilized. He started leaving real estate listing printouts on my kitchen counter, circled in red pen, as if I might forget what I owned and suddenly agree to sell it. The week before I left for Carol's, Brandon sat across from me at that same dining room table where he'd eaten 10,000 meals and said, "Mom, I want to be honest with you. Serena's dad has a project. It would be good for the whole family. He's willing to pay fair market value. For my farm," I said, "for part of it. The back 40 and the road frontage. The answer is no, Brandon." He looked at the table. "You don't even want to see the offer?" "I have seen it," I said. "Every time one of those printouts appears on my counter." He left without finishing his dinner. 2 weeks later, I drove to Savannah, and the text message arrived. Ruth was the first person I called that night from Carol's guest bedroom. She picked up on the second ring, which is what she always does. "He did what?" she said. "He filed something with the county. I don't know the exact documents yet. But given the timing, I leave for a long weekend. He moves immediately. He must have been holding paperwork ready." "That boy was never half as clever as he thought he was," Ruth said. "Want me to drive over to the farm and check on things?" "Not yet. But I need Philip to pull the county records in the morning." "I'll bring him coffee," Ruth said, as if she were talking about running a simple errand. Ruth operates on the principle that most problems in life can be addressed if you show up early enough and bring something to eat. I called Philip at 8 the next morning. He called me back at 9:15. "There's a deed transfer on record as of yesterday afternoon," he said, without preamble. Your son filed a power of attorney document dated 18 months ago, claiming you signed it and used it to transfer title into his name jointly with Serena's. That's not possible, I said. I never signed a power of attorney for Brandon. I know, Philip said, which means it's forged. And because of the trust provisions we filed, the transfer is already flagged as disputed. The county recorder's system shows a cloud on the title. No one can buy, sell, borrow against, or do anything with this property until the court resolves the dispute. I sat down on the edge of Carol's guest bed. My knee throbbed. Outside the window, a mockingbird was singing in the oak tree. How did he get a notarized signature? I asked. That's what we're going to find out. But Marilyn, he caught himself. Margaret. Whoever notarized that document may have committed a crime just as serious as the fraud itself. What do I need to do? Come home when you're ready. Not rushing the property is protected, but we need to file a formal fraud complaint and a quiet title action within the next 2 weeks. I thanked him and sat with the phone in my lap for a while. Carol appeared in the doorway with a mug of coffee and that particular expression she's worn since we were girls, the one that means she already knows something is wrong and is deciding whether to pretend she doesn't. Philip? She asked. Yes. She came in and sat beside me. How bad? He forged my signature on a power of attorney and transferred the farm deed. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I won't repeat because my sister has a mouth on her that would surprise people who only know her from church. But the sentiment was appropriate. I'm going to stay 1 more night, I told her. I'm not going to let him think he scared me into running home. Good, she said. And then we go get your land back. I drove home on a Sunday. Ruth was waiting on my porch when I pulled into the driveway, a covered dish in her lap and a look on her face that meant she'd already been busy. I talked to your neighbor Roy, she said as I got out of the car. He said a man was out here Thursday afternoon, walking the back property line with a measuring tape. Didn't introduce himself. Drove a truck with a Whitfield Land Partners logo on the side. So they'd been measuring. Before the ink was even dry on the forged documents, Serena's father had sent someone out to survey what he believed he'd just acquired. They moved fast, I said. Overconfident people always do, Ruth replied. Inside the house, nothing had been disturbed. Whatever Brandon had planned, he hadn't moved in yet. Maybe he was waiting for the dust to settle. Maybe he thought I'd call, upset and confused, and he could talk me into accepting it as a done deal. That would have been his style. Wait for me to exhaust myself with emotion, then present a clean solution that happened to benefit him entirely. He didn't call. I didn't call him either. I let the silence do its work. Monday morning, I drove to Philip's office. We spent 3 hours going through documents. The forged power of attorney was a reasonable fake my name. Gerald's old notary seal somehow obtained. A date that placed the signing nearly 2 years back. But Philip had the original trust filing with timestamps, the recorded phone conversations, and 18 months of emails between Brandon and me in which I'd clearly and repeatedly declined to sign anything related to the deed. This isn't just fraud, Philip said, sliding a document across his desk. Depending on how the DA looks at it, there may be elder financial abuse charges. That carries additional penalties in this state. File everything, I said. He looked at me over his glasses. Including criminal charges? I thought about Brandon at age 7, dragging a Christmas tree across the front yard because he'd decided it needed to be replanted in the spot where it would look better. He'd always been so certain about things that weren't his to decide. File everything, I said again. The formal notices went out Tuesday. By Wednesday, Philip had a call from a very expensive Nashville attorney representing Brandon and Serena, suggesting we discuss an amicable resolution. Philip told him politely that the discovery process would be very thorough and forwarded him a copy of the recorded phone calls. We didn't hear from that attorney again. What I heard from, on Thursday evening, was Serena. She texted me directly, which surprised me. Her message was short and formal. Mrs. Fletcher, I'd like to talk, in person if possible. Without Brandon, I think there are things you should know. I showed Ruth, who raised an eyebrow. Could be a trap. Could be, I said. But a person who's fully committed to a con doesn't reach out asking to meet alone. We agreed she could come to the house Friday afternoon. Ruth stationed herself in the kitchen with very loud opinions about remaining close by. Serena looked different when she arrived than the polished woman I'd watched evaluate my kitchen 3 years ago. Her hair was pulled back simply. She wasn't wearing the kind of shoes that were impractical for the country. She sat at my dining room table and folded her hands and didn't try to fill the silence with pleasantries. "I didn't know about the forged document," she said. "I need you to know that. Tell me what you did know," I said. She took a breath. "I knew my father wanted this land. I knew Brandon had told him you were willing to sell eventually, and that he was working on getting the paperwork lined up. I assumed that meant he was negotiating with you. I never saw the POA document until after it was filed." She paused. "I found it in his desk Thursday morning after the notices arrived. And the signature doesn't look right to me. I've seen your signature on Christmas cards. On the letter you sent us when we got married." Her jaw tightened. "Brandon told me you'd agreed to everything, that you'd signed off before you left for Savannah, and he was just handling the filing. I was never asked," I said. "I would never have agreed." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already half known. "My father needed this deal. His company has investors pulling out. This land was supposed to be the collateral that stabilized everything." She looked up at me. "I thought I was helping my family. I didn't realize my husband was stealing from you to do it." The word stealing sat between us in the quiet kitchen. "I have another question," I said. "The man with the measuring tape, who was out here the day the transfer was filed, was that your father's crew?" She pressed her lips together. "Yes. Dad had the survey team on standby. The moment Brandon confirmed the filing, they went out. So Dale Whitfield had known the timeline. He had known they were moving on a forged document, or at minimum he hadn't asked questions that might have given him uncomfortable answers. That was its own problem. And Philip would handle it in due time. "What are you going to do?" I asked her. Serena was quiet for a moment. "I called my own attorney this morning, separately from my father's, and separately from Brandon's." She met my eyes. "I'm not going to let my name stay on a fraudulent deed. That's the right decision," I said. She stood to go, and at the door she paused. "Mrs. Fletcher, for what it's worth, your farm is beautiful. It should stay yours." After she left, Ruth appeared from the kitchen doorway holding a dish towel. "Well," she said. "That wasn't what I expected." "No," I agreed. But she confirmed enough. Philip was pleased with what Serena had told me. She agreed to provide a sworn statement that she had not knowingly participated in the forged transfer and had discovered the document only after the fact. She also provided a text exchange between herself and Brandon from 2 weeks before the filing, in which he told her, "Dad's deal is basically done. I just need to handle the last signature thing. Don't worry about it." Don't worry about it. The same words he'd used with me. Brandon had a limited vocabulary when it came to the things he didn't want examined too closely. The preliminary hearing was set for a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after I'd gotten back from Savannah. Philip told me to wear something that said, "Capable, not old." I wore my navy blazer and Gerald's watch, which I'd started wearing on important occasions after he passed because it made me feel like he was standing beside me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Brandon sat across the room with his attorney, and for a moment, our eyes met. He looked away first. He'd always had trouble holding eye contact when he knew he was wrong. Judge Patricia Wills was a compact woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by people a long time ago. She reviewed Philip's filings in silence for what felt like a long time. Then she said, "Mr. Fletcher, the trust provision recorded against this property was established 2 years prior to the alleged power of attorney used in this transfer. The revocation clause is explicit and legally sound. The burden of proof on the validity of this POA is on the petitioner." She looked at Brandon's attorney. "Does your client have documentation of the circumstances under which this power of attorney was executed?" Brandon's attorney said something careful about gathering additional evidence. Judge Wills looked over her glasses at him. I'm issuing a temporary order restoring sole title to Margaret Fletcher, effective immediately. The fraudulent transfer is vacated pending full resolution. Mr. Fletcher, she said, looking directly at Brandon. I'd encourage you to consult seriously with your attorney before the next hearing. That was it. My land was mine again. Established by a judge, on the record, in a room with witnesses. Not because I'd argued louder than my son or threatened him or begged. Because years ago, I had walked into Philip's office with a quiet feeling behind my ear that I'd learned to trust. And I had prepared, Brandon called that evening. I almost didn't answer. Then I decided I needed to hear his voice, not for his sake, but for mine. Mom. He sounded flat, deflated. The energy of someone whose plan had just publicly failed. Brandon, you could have just talked to me, he said. Before making all of this a legal thing, I let that sit for a moment. I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. You forged my signature. You transferred my property without my knowledge or consent. And your position is that I should have talked to you? Silence. I needed this, he said, finally. Serena's dad was pressuring us. The deal was already half structured. I thought if it was done, you'd accept it. You'd see the money and realize it was the right move. It's my land, I said. Mine and your father's. We built that place before you were born. Dad's gone, Mom. Yes, he is. Which means it falls to me to protect what he and I built. Not to hand it over because you needed a win with your father-in-law. Another silence, longer this time. What happens now? He asked. The criminal complaint has been filed. The DA's office will determine what charges to pursue. That process is out of my hands. You filed criminal charges against me. He said it flatly, not as a question. I filed a report accurately describing what happened. Yes, I'm your son. I know who you are, Brandon. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the back field, where Gerald's fence posts still stood straight after 30 years. That's exactly why this hurts as much as it does. He was quiet for so long, I checked to see if the call had dropped. I don't know what I was thinking, he said finally. And his voice had changed younger somehow, less defended. Serena's dad made it sound simple, like it was just paperwork, like you wouldn't even mind once it was settled. And you believed that because you wanted to. Yeah? He said quietly. I had thought about what I would say in this moment. In the weeks since returning from Savannah, I had rehearsed being angry, being cold, being distant. What came out instead was something quieter and more final. I love you, I said. I will always love you. But I am not going to pretend that what you did was a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. You planned this. You forged my name. You had a surveyor on my land the same afternoon the paperwork filed. That's not a mistake, Brandon. That's a choice. He didn't argue with that. The courts will do what they do, I continued. That's not something I can control anymore. But I want you to know, not to make you feel worse, but because it's true that the thing you took from me wasn't the deed. I would have been hurt by that and fought it regardless. What you actually took was the version of you I still believed in. The little boy who used to follow his father around that field, asking questions about every single thing. I miss that boy. I'm not sure what happened to him. A sound on the line that might have been Brandon starting to speak, or might have been something else. I didn't wait to find out. Take care of yourself, I said. I mean that. I hung up and stood at the window until the field went dark. Ruth came over that evening with pie and the good sense, as always, not to fill the silence with anything except her steady company. We sat on the back porch the way we had sat on porches together for 3 decades, watching the same sky shift from blue to purple to the particular dense black of a Tennessee summer night, with no town close enough to dim the stars. You okay? She asked. Not entirely, I said, but more than I expected to be. She cut 2 slices of pie and handed me one. You know what Gerald would say. Something unhelpful but accurate, I said, and she laughed. He'd say the land is still here, same as it was. I looked out at the darkened field, at the fence line Gerald had built, at the magnolia tree I'd planted the year Brandon was born, its wide leaves catching what little light remained. The land was still here. It had absorbed 40 years of our labor and grief and stubbornness and small daily joys. And it would absorb this too. The full hearing came 6 weeks later. Philip presented the case in his meticulous, patient way. The trust documents, the timestamps, the recorded conversations, the evidence of the forged notary seal, which turned out to belong to a notary in Nashville, who had let his certification lapse 18 months prior, and who had, under the pressure of an investigation, confirmed that he had signed off on documents he hadn't properly witnessed. That was its own set of charges. The DA pursued 3 counts against Brandon: fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation of an elderly person, which is what the law calls what he'd done, regardless of how much softer the family version sounded. Serena's cooperation had made the difference in the clarity of the case. She had filed separately from Brandon by then. Their marriage, barely a year old, was dissolving in the same direction as his other ventures quickly, without a clean landing. I felt something for her that I hadn't expected to feel, something adjacent to sympathy. She had married a man who had promised her a solution and delivered a problem. And now she was relearning, at 29, the expensive lesson that shortcuts tend to lead somewhere you didn't mean to go. She sent me a card after the hearing. Inside, in neat handwriting, she'd written, "I'm sorry for my part in this. I hope the farm gives you many more good years." I put it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where I keep things I want to see every morning. The weeks after the final ruling had the particular quality of an exhale after holding your breath for too long. I repainted the front porch railing, which had been needing it since spring. I bought a new rocking chair to replace the one that had finally given up on the south side. Ruth's granddaughter started coming out on weekends to help with the garden, a 14-year-old girl with her grandmother's same steady disposition and a gift for knowing when to be quiet. I hadn't decided yet what to do with Zachary with Brandon's room, with the space he occupied in my future. The lawyers were still working. The courts were still moving. Those things would resolve in their own time. What I had decided was smaller and more immediate. I was going to plant a new section of the south field next spring. Lavender, which makes no practical sense on a working farm, and which Gerald would have found entirely baffling, and which I had always wanted and never done. I was going to do it because the land was mine. And that meant it could hold whatever I decided to give it. Grief and history and lavender and all. Ruth said she'd help me mark the rows. I told her I'd make the pie this time. If you've ever had someone you trusted decide that what you built belonged to them, drop a comment below. And if this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. We're building something here together, and every one of you is part of that.